All right, hey guys. We're going to do a little bit of an investigation into a document by a guy I'm sure you've never heard of before. The man's name was Abraham Lincoln. I'm just kidding, that was a bad joke. And this is a speech he gave, and it's his second inaugural address. And so some of you guys may know what this word means, but inaugural, that's when a president comes into power, he's inaugurated. That's where they do the oath of office. He puts his hand on the Bible, gives a big speech. This is his second, which means he's been re-elected. And he's giving a speech to the country, basically talking about what's going to happen in the next part of his presidency. He's been president from 1861 to 1865. And so this is his beginning of his second term, March 4th, 1865. Here's the other thing that I want us to look at is that this date is really significant because by this point, the Civil War is not over. It's close, but it's basically following, you may know about this or you may not, Sherman's March to the Sea. What that was a general named William Tecumseh Sherman basically set out from southeast Tennessee, marching towards Atlanta. So Atlanta is one of those major cities of the Confederacy, and he captured Atlanta, and then he decided, okay, what we have to do is we just have to make the war so terrible that we're going to march all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And if we meet any resistance, if we find any Confederate forts or bases or support like farms or like armories, we're just going to burn them. And they do it. They basically march all the way to the sea. Incidentally, my great-great-grandfather, William Benjamin Sisson, was on that march. And they get to Savannah, and they've basically just broken the back of the Confederacy. Then they turn and start marching north into South Carolina, which started the Civil War, and into North Carolina on their way up to D.C. So the Confederacy is still like functioning, but barely. It's like on its last legs. So that's important for us to know. Okay, so then we're going to get down here. This gives us a little bit of context. Weeks of wet weather preceding Lincoln's second inauguration had caused Pennsylvania Avenue, that is, if you ever go there, that's one of the main roads in D.C. It's what the White House is on, to become a sea of mud and standing water. Thousands of spectators stood in thick mud at the Capitol grounds to hear the president, same place that they do the inauguration now. As he stood on the east portico to take the executive oath, the completed Capitol dome over the president's head was a physical reminder of the resolve of his administration throughout the years of Civil War. Okay, so I can't remember if this is true, so I could be wrong. But I think at the beginning of the Civil War, the Capitol dome is not finished. And so it sounds like they finished the dome during the Civil War. If I'm wrong on that, then what we can at least say from this is the nation is still standing, right? The Capitol dome is still there. The Union is still held together. Chief Justice Salmon Chase, who was in Lincoln's cabinet for a while, administered the oath of office. In a little more than a month, the president would be assassinated. So that brings on even a little bit more meaning to this. He's dead in a little more than a month. So 1 month to live. Can tell us something about where Lincoln's mind was at this time. Okay, so let's start in. Fellow countrymen, that's how he starts it. And I think that is very interesting because one of the things that Lincoln really wanted to do was bring the South back into the Union, like unify the country again. And so you could look at this and be like, oh, yeah, that's just how he's starting the speech. But I would say that the fact that he says fellow countrymen is everything because he's speaking to the nation, right? And what he considers the nation is all Americans, even ones that are rebelling against the United States. So he's speaking to everyone. He doesn't single out Confederates. My dad always tells this story that's really interesting. I'm on a tangent. But at one point, George McClellan, who was the general of the Union Army early in the Army, was fighting the Confederates, and he drove them back from what Union-held territory into Virginia. And he reported to Lincoln and said, we have driven the enemy from our territory. And Lincoln said, hey, it's all our territory. If they're in Virginia, that's the United States. I don't care if they say it's the Confederacy, it's still the United States, which tells us a little bit about his mindset. Okay, so we're going to start going. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. So basically, if you were ever listening to a speech, this might be a kind of thing that you'd want to hear. Oh, good. It means it's going to be short. A less occasion for an extended address. Then a statement somewhat in detail of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. That's because this is when the Civil War, when he was first in office, his first inaugural, the Civil War is about to get going. And so he had to talk about what the course to be pursued was going to be. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest, which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation. So remember what we said earlier? Civil War is still going on. Civil War is still occurring. Still being waged. I gotta make sure I say Civil War. Little that is new could be presented. So basically what he's saying right here is, hey, we have talked about and declared and argued about the course of the Civil War. It's absorbed all our attention. It's taken up all our energies, and there's really nothing else I can say. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. So, what he's saying is the war is going well for the Union. There's reason to be hopeful, which at times there was not reason to be hopeful. There were times where if you were a Union official or a Union soldier, you might have been worried about Washington, D.C. being captured and the Confederacy becoming legitimate, or even capturing some Union territory, or even getting states like Kentucky or Maryland to flip to the Confederacy. That was a real fear for a long time. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, that's his last inauguration, that's what he's referring to, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. No one wanted war, is what Lincoln's saying. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's wishful thinking. So I'm going to put could be true. I think there were some people who were probably anxious for war. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated, that's a big word for like hated or despised, war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. What Lincoln's doing here is he's explaining the difference between the Union and the Confederacy. One of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. Well, who made war? Who started it? We can probably remember Fort Sumter, right? And the Confederacy. They made the war, and the contrast for Lincoln is the Union accepted it. The Confederacy wanted to split the Union. The Union wanted to maintain it and accepted war. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. This is kind of interesting. That slavery was the cause of the war, and everybody knew it in some way. It's kind of interesting, especially when we think about today. I'm going to make a note of that, because maybe we'll remember that. Relevant now. I have friends who would say, that's not true. That's not what it's about. Well, here's Lincoln in 1865 saying, yeah, that's what it's about. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war. Separate the Union is what that's saying. While the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. What he's saying is the Union didn't want to abolish slavery. They just didn't want it to spread. They didn't want Nebraska to be a slave state or Kansas to be a slave state. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. No one thought it was going to be as bad or as bloody or as long as it's been. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Here's some just powerful statements he makes. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. What he's saying is both sides were praying for God's help. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just, it's like a righteous or a fair God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. What he's saying, what's this sound like? Wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces? He's basically saying getting their livelihood, getting their wealth from slavery. And so what he's saying is, how weird is it to say that people in the South might have been praying that God would help them subject people to slavery so they could be wealthy. But Lincoln says, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. Some of you guys may know this. He's referencing Scripture. And that's something that, I'm going to sound ignorant, but I think that's what Jesus says at one point. Yeah, he does. He does. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. That he's quoting something there too. I'm pretty sure that is from the Bible. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to them? So, what he's saying here is people always say God's good and just. And maybe the Civil War as punishment for people who engaged in slavery was fair. So as horrible as it is, maybe all that punishment needed to happen, right? It's a pretty crazy statement. Powerful statement, that's a better word. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil. Who's a bondsman? Someone who's in bondage. Chains, right? So who's he talking about? He's saying we've had 250 years of slavery. of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. What's he saying? This civil war was God's judgment. It's pretty powerful. It's God's judgment for what? Slavery, for uncompensated work, for the loss of freedom for anyone of the African race, for the violence perpetuated against those people who had no freedom. And this is the really powerful part and something that might be helpful for us in Humanity 2.0. With malice, that's anger toward none, might be a better word for it than anger, but with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we were in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves and with all nations. Well, why not have malice with malice towards none? That means forgiving the South. Is that what that means? They started the war. He's saying malice towards none. That's Lincoln's attitude towards these people that just started a civil war that consumed, at least 600,000 lives, probably more. But firmness in righteousness, basically, is what he's saying. We're going to bind up the nation's wounds and care for those people who have fought in this horrible, horrible war so that we can have a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves. It's a real unifying speech at the end of our biggest, most dramatic period of disunity in our country's history. And gives you some insight into Abraham Lincoln's feelings and thoughts on the Civil War. All right. Thanks, guys.